Thank you, Mary. It's an honor to be here at Historic Calgary Week, and I'd very much like to thank my sponsors, Historic Calgary Week, the Chinese Cultural Center, and the UBC University Hub. In today's 50-minute talk, you will learn about Chinese genealogy. And I mean for this to be an overview. By no means will I be able to cover everything in 50 minutes. And so we're going to go at it in terms of story. I will present to you 3 cases illustrating each of the foundational record sets in Chinese genealogy and give you an overview in between. And then we'll wrap up and I will take questions. Genealogy is nothing without records. And surprisingly, in Chinese genealogy in Canada, there are only 3 foundational record sets. They are, going around the circle, the CI-44 collection, the General Record, the General Register of Chinese Immigration, and the CI-9 collection. All 3 of these collections relate to the Chinese Immigration Act, which was in place in Canada between 1885 and 1947. So let's start with the CI-44 collection. First of all, I would like to share that this collection is brand new to Canada as of this month, thanks to the efforts of the curator, Catherine Clement, and her team, including the archivist, June Chow. CI-44s are kind of like a marriage between immigration and census records, whereby all Chinese in Canada, after the Exclusion Act was implemented on July 1st, 1923, were registered, and they were given 1 year to register. This created a body of about 60,000 individual records, which are rich in detail. This includes all Chinese in the country, I should emphasize. That includes the natural born. My father, who was a twice over natural born Canadian, was registered under the CI-44 and required to carry a card designating his status as an alien under the Department of Immigration and Colonization. If you weren't in the country, if in fact you were traveling outside the country, you were registered on your return to the country. And on your return to the country, if you had not paid a head tax on your previous trip and you were later reassessed to no longer be under that exempt status, then you were forced to pay $500. Further, if you were born in the country after 1923, and granted there were not many families in this category, then you were registered on birth. And so there was no escaping the CI-44 registration process. So let's look at this in terms of case number 1, the case of Wang Bo Hua. So Wang Bo Hua was a boy when he arrived in Canada. Now, I chose this record for a couple of reasons. First of all, he gives his address as 814A Central Street, Calgary. He's just 11 years old, and he actually arrives in Canada on the 23rd of September, 1923, which is actually after the implementation of the Exclusion Act. A little known fact about the Exclusion Act is that persons who were in transit when the act was implemented were still admitted to the country. So it's possible to still find Chinese migrants to Canada in the months from July through to December, although not many. One of the salient points about this collection is that they all have photographs. And so unlike a census, you get to see their faces. It also provides immigration information, file numbers, attesters. And with this information, in other words, that he, for example, was going to probably live with his father, who, it notes, a restaurant keeper, at 814 Central. And so I tried to find the father. The pertinent details when you're looking for another person related to a record, in this case, would be the name, Wang Bo-Wa, and we don't know which of these three names is the surname. The address at 814 Central Street, Calgary. Now, there's no Central Street in Calgary, but it is likely that the immigration officer meant Center Street. And the remarks, the father, restaurant keeper at 814 Central Street, Calgary, and the date, 1923. So in genealogy, then, you want to search for other matching CI-44 records for Wongs or Bows or Was in Calgary in 1923, also using city directories and censuses. But if you're familiar with Chinese genealogy, I want to stress that you would not be using the general register to find the father, because you don't have enough information at this time to find him. So under city directories, I looked for a restaurant keeper at 814, and I was able to find these two pieces of data. On the bottom, there's the Ontario Cafe, Lee Fark, the proprietor, at 814A Center Street. And then under the address listings, I was able to find under 814A, the Ontario Cafe. So we have a result of a name to search, in other words, the Ontario Cafe, and we have a surname, Lee Fark. Now, that was quite interesting because the 1923 records suggest that the restaurant keeper was a father and potentially a Wong. And so the name Lee Fark and Wang Bo-Wa don't match. So I looked for both. And that's when I ran into my first big issue, because when I looked in the census under the nominal search, I couldn't find anything. And that's quite normal in Chinese genealogy, not to be able to find anything under Li or Fark or Wang or Bo or Wa or any soundex permutation about that. But then when I go into the census districts, censuses are quite often not broken up to help us Chinese genealogists. That, in fact, they often break Chinatown into many subdistricts, which just makes it even more challenging to find. And so to find where Chinatown was in 1921 for Calgary, I had to figure out where Center Street occurred. And it turned out that it occurred in 12 different subdistricts. And I had to go through every one of them. So it took me 5 hours to go through 12 different subdistricts, 780 pages on average, and I couldn't find him. Nil is the word for not in location. And so that's where we end on this case. We have Wang Bo-Wa, who arrived in Canada, age 11, was one of the cluster of boys admitted to Canada after the Exclusion Act was passed. His family did pay $500 head tax, and he was registered for 3 different records, a CI-4, a CI-5. Those are both head tax certificates. He was registered through the CI-44 process, which is that Chinese-only census, and he was registered on the General Register of Chinese Immigration on his arrival. His father was possibly named Lee Fark. He ran the Ontario Cafe at 814 Center Street North, Calgary. And the next steps would be to find if Wang Bo-Wa traveled with any cousins or family, to find their names, and then potentially to check another one of the Chinese-only collections to see if any of Wang, Bo, Wa, Li, or Fark are shown on the CI9 collections. Okay, so now that you have a taste of what a Chinese genealogy case looks like, let's talk about Chinese genealogy. It's quite interesting because even as late as the 2010s, Chinese genealogy has been called impossible. I have a story for you from my friend Liping Wang who told me this, that Hua Li, when she was researching her great-grandfather, she knew his business name was Hua Li and that he operated in the Caribou. So when she contacted the local curator and asked for help in figuring out whether Hua Li was the name, the curator said that she was embarking on an impossible mission to find the real name of our great-grandfather. So, spoiler alert from the title, Leping was able to find her great-grandfather, but simply to say that Chinese genealogy, even as late as 2017, has been considered impossible. And so let's talk about why it's impossible. Chinese genealogy a genealogy that is considered impossible might have no BMDs. In genealogy, that's our shorthand for birth, marriage, death, and actually baptism records. There might be few original records. There are few authored sources, in other words, work where other scholars have gone into the subject and produced works which other researchers can build upon. It might not be in an English or European language, and it might not actually be considered historically significant by an archivist. And that actually was the case up until relatively recently, the 1970s, which causes record loss. I brainstormed some genealogies that could be considered impossible in Canada, and here we are. That includes Black, Indigenous, Japanese, Chinese, and so many more. Honestly, when you look at the field of underrepresented populations in genealogy, it's wide open. So I am all about encouraging people to get into underrepresented population genealogy. So let's roll back a little bit and talk about, where does information come from? Primarily, record sources are government at every level. It could come from church records, and it comes from the family or the businesses that they run. This produces the information from which we do our work. Churches produce birth, baptism, marriage, and death records. These are matching records. They could have church publications and governments, which might list the people that served in the church. And they're a huge resource if church records are available. Government produces censuses, immigration records, tax records, vital statistics, and probate records, wills and such. Vital statistics can match birth, marriage, and death records. And so you could have two different sets of records produced by different groups that could provide same or similar information. And then family records could include a DNA, family Bibles, where people recorded birth and marriages and deaths, interviews with first persons, letters, photos, and wills. This creates then a structure in genealogy where records are considered generally available by governing bodies, such as the aforementioned BMDs, census records, voting records, voters lists, DNA, immigration, land, and will records. We'll get back to this graphic in a sec. It never fails, but when you're talking about records for difficult genealogical cases, such as adoption or like anything, then people always ask, well, what if I do a DNA test? So let's talk about that. In Chinese ancestry, the goal is to find first or second cousinships. It's with these closer cousinships. Now, a first cousinship means that your first cousins are related to you through the closest relative. So you have your closest living relative is your grandfather. That means that your parents are siblings. A second cousinship means that your great-grandparents are your closest living relative, or your grandparents are siblings. So first or second cousinships help you find closer living relatives. That's just how it works in genealogy. Many people take DNA tests to discover their ethnicity, but I have to tell you that ethnicity as a question is not usually an issue when we carry our ethnicity usually on our faces. And for Asians, to take one case, Ancestry DNA, which is the largest current provider of genetic material, they have about 69,000 people in 84 world regions with 6,500 reference samples. And that sounds really good, except that breaks down to a limited number of regions. Now, to compare, Central Ireland is a Northern European country, and Ancestry DNA for Central Ireland, a country of 7 million people and 84,000 square kilometers, has 40 regions. 40 for 84,000 kilometers. So let's compare that to Ancestry's regions for China. One of the most populous, if not the most populous country in the world, with 1.4 billion people, 9.6 million square kilometers, the third largest country in the world, and Ancestry currently has 6 regions. 6. So there is room for improvement. So if you can't get a first or second cousinship and your region is, for example, the Guangzhou region, that's not a lot of help at the moment, but there is room for improvement. So if we are then looking at it and so-called impossible genealogy, then we need to think about tools. And so we're going to go over 4. Experts, knowledge of history, records, and tech tools. So some of you may know that I do Chinese genealogy, and I don't actually speak or read Chinese, which is an anomaly. And that means that I use tools. So some Chinese language tools that I use all of them, are Pleco on my phone, as well as Google Translate. I use all the language packs on my devices. I use it on my PC, and I use it on my Mac. I have simplified and traditional Chinese loaded on both my PC and my Mac. I do use the Google Translate app, but only ever from Chinese into English, never English into Chinese. It just doesn't work, especially when we're talking about names. I use the Google Chrome browser with the automatic translation feature enabled. It is a game changer. And I always have a list of trusted experts, because even after my translation efforts, I still want to run it past people who speak and read Chinese to know that the work that I have created is still correct. So, experts and mentors. In this slide, I would like to honor 3 of my mentors, Dr. Celia Tan, Dr. Henry Yu, and Dr. Zhang. Celia and Dr. Zhang are both working in Guangdong province in Jiangmen, and Henry is at UBC. Let's not forget our own experts, our own family, or our community elders. This is a diagram of a family tree, an early sketch that I made of my grandfather's, my maternal grandfather's family, when I was chatting with my grandmother. She knew the stories, and I drew this first tree. So do not fail to interview all of your family elders. They know the stuff, and if they are still here, please interview them. Okay, so we've gone from tools and experts, and we're going to go into history. So what do we mean by that? Here's again a brainstorm of all the different kinds of history that a genealogical search could focus on. Today, we're going to look at really just legal and regulatory. and maybe a little bit of political. But you see that genealogy has so many other areas where you can look. Like if your family was urban, you can look into the urban history of the area that your family lived in, and it just wide open field. So let's look at history for the Chinese. Here's a timeline that I put together. Now, Henry has put together, is researching that the first Chinese in Canada were actually 1788 at Nootka Sound. He led a team of students / archaeologists to go look at the site. And while no to look at the site. Now, the reason why I bring this to your attention is that quite often people think that the history of the Chinese in Canada is really from the railway forward. And what I would like to point out is that that ignores the 50 years of traceable Chinese family history pertaining to the gold rush. That's 1848 through 98 in British Columbia and the Yukon. And so then in this timeline, we've got some important dates, such as the implementation of the first Chinese Immigration Act. That's at the federal level. Then the Exclusion Act, which tightened the net in 1923. The Exclusion Act repeal in 1947. Voting being reinstated in 1948. The immigration system changing to a points-based as opposed to a race-based system in 1967. And then the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Like all of these laws and like macroeconomic and political forces very much affected the Chinese Canadian history. And I've written more about this in your handout, which you can take home. So let's then look at the legal and regulatory framework, like who creates the records that we need as genealogists. This excellent graphic by archivist June Chow, which is in your handout, so you don't need to screen capture it. And also, it encapsulates all of the records that were created by the Immigration Act through that 60-year period. It also gives a rough overview of where you can find some of these original records. Again, the handout is a 26-page comprehensive look at the various sites that I mentioned, from Ancestry and Family Search, Library and Archives Canada, Heritage Canadiana, straight on through to a deep dive that I did last year for Historic Calgary Week into all of the Chinese genealogical resources that are available here in Alberta. So important sample laws include federal and provincial laws. Here are just a slight overview. In my view, the Chinese Immigration Act and the American Exclusion Act are about population control. In addition, the Canadian Citizenship Act, whereas the Dominion Elections Act for Chinese was about civil rights. At the provincial level, I chose 3 different provincial level laws in 3 different provinces to show that it wasn't only BC, and that researching Chinese genealogy really is affected by your province of origin. And so we've got business, competition, and ethics, anti-Chinese laws in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Ontario. So how does that affect records for genealogy? For example, in British Columbia, First of all, BC is overweighted in its importance for all Chinese genealogy in North America. So many Chinese migrants came through the ports of Vancouver and Victoria, and then eventually migrated across the country or stayed in BC or went to the United States. And yet, even though BC was created as a province in 1872, and its Vital Statistics Act governing the registration of births and marriages and deaths, in 1872, two groups were specifically excluded from that registration process. They were the Chinese and the Indigenous for 25 years. This means if your person was born, married, or died during that exclusion period, it is possible you won't find an original record for them. I mean, do look, but if you can't find it, there might be a good reason why. So let's talk about the Exclusion Act and why it's important for genealogy. First of all, as you probably saw in the first story about CI 44 records, the Immigration Act is a package of laws at the national level between 1885 and 1947. It wasn't about voting. Voting was the Dominion Elections Act. Some people do get that mixed up between that and the Chinese Immigration Act. The Chinese Immigration Act is popularly believed to be only about immigration, probably because of the name immigration. But in fact, it was a multi-million-dollar bureaucracy controlling, curtailing, surveilling Chinese in the country for the entire period. I think of it more accurately as the Indian Act, except for Chinese persons. In addition, provinces had their own jurisdictions. There were 200 separate laws in BC alone, restricting civil rights, elections, employment, land ownership, and Saskatchewan banned white women from working in Chinese restaurants. This means that the laws that tracked Chinese produced a mountain of paperwork. There were 58 separate kinds of certificates alone for Chinese persons. Multiple registers, Chinese-only case files, and they are a kind of proxy, a legally produced, government-sanctioned proxy for vital statistic records. Think of travel as immigration. As I said, there are three foundational sets of records. Now let's go into the next set, CI-9s. The CI-9s are a Chinese-only certificate. They are certificates that Chinese persons had to first apply for, pay, register, and it allowed them the right of coming back into the country. Now, understand that if a Chinese person during this period wanted to leave Canada and not return, they were welcome to do so without going through the CI-9 process. However, if a Chinese person wanted to leave the country and come back, including the Canadian-born, they had to first register. So I think of it as a re-entry certificate. This means that multiple re-entry certificates were possible for your people. In addition, my research shows that about 147,000 of these records were created, but only about a third of them have been imaged, which means that there are huge gaps for these things online. And in my group on Facebook, Genealogy for Asian Canadians, we are currently in the process of finding these things, figuring out where the gaps are, and harassing Heritage Canadiana to get them digitized. And so thanks to our efforts, a further 27,000 records will soon be online. I am really looking forward to Lily Cho's talk later on today, where in her talk on mass capture, she's going to go into a deep dive on CI-9s. But in the meantime, please let me warm you up about CI9s in a story about my cousin, Queenie Yip. Now, this is a picture of the Chinese Students Athletic Association, what can I say, soccer stars in the 1930s, in a time when there was little to be grateful or thankful about. The Chinese athletics were absolute kings of the soccer field. And my cousin Queenie was the team captain and lead. Queenie was a star. He was born in Vancouver. He led not only the Chinese Students Athletics Association, but he was also president of the tennis club. Now, the Chinese students won the Iroquois Cup against all odds. And then later, Queenie went on to lead the highly coveted all British Columbia BC Mainland Cup. Imagine all Chinatowns across North America followed this team to victory. Queenie later played international matches in soccer and tennis between 1935 and 1940. And here's the thing, he needed to apply for CI9s for each trip. So here's a brief timeline. He went to Seattle in 1935, Bellingham later in 1935, again in August to Portland. 1937, he went to Seattle, and then he played more matches, entering in Bellingham in 39. Oh, dear. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 CI9s. We think travel is difficult now, but holy cow. So I took the information from all 5 of these CI9 records and distilled them down. So here they are. And if I was putting this together in a genealogical case and I didn't know my cousin, this is what I would do. Here are all 5, they're CI9 numbers, and they're cross-referencing information. The thing about a CI9 record is that not only does it contain a plethora of detail in its singularity, but if you have more than one record, you can start cross-referencing each of them to compare the information they provide. And so that's where I'd like to bring you to this. The first record says on the 13th of April in 1935, it says there was a previous CI9 number, 713. Also look at 2479. Also, his section 18 is 16003, and there's a file number. So let me translate this for you. In other words, it says there's a previous CI9 713. In other words, there's a CI9 I haven't found, which if I wanted to go digging, maybe it hasn't been digitized, but I know it exists. So I have the CI9 number, and I know that it's before 1935. In addition, it says C number 2479. Notice number 2 is number 22479. In other words, 2442 is cross-referencing 2479. In other words, the scribes at Chinese immigration kept the CI9 information of the earlier one updated with the later one. This is an important point I want to stress. Chinese immigration scribes and agents were constantly cross-referencing and looking back and forth at records to see if the person who was referencing the record was the same person. In other words, it's not static in time, and it doesn't only go forward. It also goes backwards. Use that outlook on all Chinese immigration records to cross-reference. Similarly, it says section 18, 16003. Section 18 is section 18 of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923. How do I know that? Because it's after 1923. Also, section 18 of the Chinese Exclusion Act registered all Chinese persons in the country. This is the CI-44 collection. What they're saying is there is a CI-44 record for Queenie Yip, and this is the number. So now I know how to find Queenie's CI-44 record. So on and so forth. So for the rest of this referencing, we've got the previous CI9, the last CI40, the CI44, and a file 6703. Notice that all four of the 5 records reference file 6703. This means that at least until 1937, there was a Chinese case file as yet not located for my cousin. So taking that information of everything we've gleaned so far, we now know that, first of all, there was a previous CI9, number 713. So we can try to find that record. And if it is not yet digitized, we can ask Heritage Canadiana to digitize it. We have his birth information from the CI9. From that, maybe we can acquire a copy of the birth registration if it's online. It's over 1905 is over 100. Nope. It's not yet online at the BC Archives because the privacy date is 120 years, but it will be in 2 years. So I'll just diarize for that date and then get a copy of his birth registration record. Let's see. It has his address information, which means that I can find all the censuses. In 1935, that means I've got the 1931, 1921, and so on and so forth, going right back to his birth. 1905, so that knocks out the 1901, but 1911, 1921, 1931. So 3, I can find him on 3 census records. It has his occupation in the 1930s. That means I should be able to find some information about him in city directories, even accounting for the fact that city directories sometimes listed Chinese persons under the word Orientals. In addition, I know that Queenie entered the United States 5 times. That suggests that Queenie had an American case file. Okay. So that's the CI9 collection. Now let's talk about the third foundational set. The General Register of Chinese Immigration was created by, again, the Chinese Immigration Act. It was the central register, meaning that it was held at Ottawa, while all the satellite offices in Canada reported back to Ottawa. That includes probably information, I think, from Hong Kong and potentially the Canadian consuls in the United States. But right now, all I know is that all of the immigrant information, the port information from Vancouver, Victoria, Halifax, potentially all the land border crossings were centralized in Ottawa. It was a working document for the immigration agents, meaning that it wasn't just a once and done. I have seen it updated for up to 20 years and longer, reporting on all sorts of information about a person, even persons in the country before 1885. It was held at Library and Archives Canada and also the University of British Columbia. This is what it looks like. And if you haven't seen one before, it has a huge amount of information. Again, similar to a census, except extremely granular. Here are 20 different types of information that you can use. I personally, when I get a General Register of Chinese Immigration record, I transcribe each one of the headings and the information. So let's look at it using the story of Yi Jinwo. So Yi Jinwo was 34 years old and a single male person when he arrived in June 1903. Now, I picked this person because I wanted to stress that he was processed in June 1903. Now, 1903 is when the Immigration Act changed its head tax laws from $100 to $500. And so Yi Jinwo was fortunate in arriving and being processed on the 22nd of June, because it was 15 days before the head tax was raised fivefold to $500. He came from the village of Chu Bay, and we will assume for our purposes that his name was Yi. His surname was Yi, but we don't know that for sure. Here's a snippet of his register. So the next thing as a genealogist that I would do, transcribe the data. Then note if any similar names are also on the record who arrived on the same ship and were from a similar area of origin, especially if they were all from Taishan, or Toisan. Make a list of the group of all the similar names, and then you have a research cluster of people to improve your chances that you will find this person. Then you compare your results with the University of British Columbia's Register of Chinese Immigrants to Canada, and then look at the other two foundational record collections. I've just mentioned the CI-44 collection and the CI-9 collection, and all of the people in your research cluster. Okay, so that's our research strategy. So taken from that, going back to the record, we're now going to look at all the persons of similar name from a similar district who arrived on the same ship. Yi Xingjiang, Yi Jinwo, Chuck Wo, Yi Li Go, Yi Yimwo, Yi Xiu Lai, Yi Sun Young, and Yi Xiao Yi. It's in your handout. So that's how you can use the UBC Register of General Register, the UBC Register of Chinese Immigration at UBC. So using that information, then we cluster research every one of the persons that we've identified, and I was able to find one of them at Ancestry, Dan Yi Yi. Dan was living in Moose Jaw in 1924. Here he is. These records are so good with their photos. Now, Dan went by multiple names. Now, this is a wrinkle in Chinese genealogy that you just have to get used to. They could be various different spellings. It could be the immigration agent. It could be Dan himself. He could have taken an alias. And so here are the multiple names that we know for Dan Yi. when we compare the result of the CI-44 to the General Register, it is not the name that we're usually trying to match. Because of the plethora of names and the uncertainty that the name-based search brings, we want to match it up on the unique identifiers provided by the head tax certificates, in this case, the CI-36, number 10569, issued the 11th of January, 1916. 10569. So in this case, we're looking for Yi Jin Wo. Our next steps are to look for Yi Dan, find his son, mentioned in his CI-44 record, look in CI-44s and then the 1921 census. Notice that Yi Bell is away on a visit. That means Chinese rancher certificates, look for CI-9s. Yi Dan, he has a CI-36 certificate. There is one small CI-36 register that is digitized and available on Family Search, so we will check there. And then continue building the cluster research, looking for Yi Jin Wo. So in closing, what I'd like to say is that while general genealogy assumes that all of these records are available for your population, I can tell you that often my cases sometimes look like this. The records that are available are through the government. They are generally in the immigration category, and death and taxes. Death, will, taxes, and immigration. That's how you can prove a case. This means that we are often looking at record scarcity. And when records are sparse, we need to be very careful about leaping to conclusions that a single record can prove our person. That means we double down on our process, we use the tools of analysis, and we write to evaluate our empirical evidence to constantly reevaluate and reassess our results. Chinese genealogy really does take you back to the basics. When you look at a record and you look at the why, you identify gaps. And for me, identifying why a gap exists is just a key part of Chinese genealogy. But in doing this, we move it from the realm of impossible to not only provable, but to a genealogical proof standard. I would like to mention that I have completed my accreditation study for the International Commission for the Accreditation of Professional Genealogists, otherwise known as ICAP-Gen. It was passed for level 1 with a grade of greater than 90%. It cost me over 1,600 hours. I revised it about 100 times. It was about $3,500 in subcontracting and records. I did it. It was my COVID project. And it is now available at archives, museums, and on request, because it proves the first Chinese-Canadian family of Canada. Alexander Wang Gamyao, his parents, and 2 levels of his generational descendants. Here's a list of the sources I used, and I thank you so much for your time and attention.